Welcome to another edition of Real Life Renos, the podcast. I'm your host, Karen Brown, and today we begin a short series on accessibility in the residential environment. Through the series, we'll look at the history of accessible building, what we need to do to change how we all look at accessible building, and the three key areas of a home, new or existing, that are important to turn an inaccessible home into one that anyone and everyone can access. We'll be doing all of that with a familiar voice on our podcast, Ron Wickman. Ron is an architect who specializes in barrier-free design, and he joins us today from Edmonton, Alberta. Welcome, Ron.
Thanks. It's great to be here.
We've done a couple of podcasts together in the past, and people can access those through my website or yours. But today we want to take a step back and look at the history of residential design as well as the market trends, because in order to understand where we are today, it helps to be able to understand where we've come from, where we are today, and then we can look forward at what needs to be done in the future. So can you start us off by talking a little bit about the history of residential design?
Yeah, for sure. And I guess that's a long conversation. So I'll kind of keep it to the idea of as it relates to accessible design, the accessible culture. I think it's fair to say that throughout the history, though, of our residential design, most of what we've designed and built has been for what we would call the average person. And the average person also would have been the person building the homes. So it's fair to say that we're looking at a house being designed for a roughly 6 foot tall male, because that's who was typically building homes. So the heights of light switches, windows, doors, all that kind of stuff was related to this average person. And I think today it's fair to say that there's no such thing as an average person. But the industry has just never really acknowledged that. So even today, I think most single-family homes are designed for this ideal 1950s family, a wife, a husband, 2 kids and a dog, white picket fence, that kind of thing. And the wife stays at home and the husband goes out to work, and well, we know that just is like actually rare these days
for sure.
To see. So this idea that we still design for this kind of ideal seems odd to me. The other thing that I think is important to mention now is the fact that here in Canada, we do live in a colder climate, and the basement has had a tremendous influence on the way we build our homes. So originally, basements didn't exist. So we would have built to get our foundations below our frost line, maybe with a crawl space. But then somebody figured out that maybe we can just dig a little bit deeper, and you'll get all this bonus space underneath your main floor that could be used for storage, and you could put your mechanical room down there, and you could have a nice recreation room, maybe TV room, that kind of thing. So the basement and dealing with the basement has had a tremendous influence on how we've evolved with our housing design. And a lot of times that's gone counter to making things accessible for people, especially people who use wheelchairs. So what I've seen in my time is bungalows were very common in the 50s and 60s. Then we started going to trying to gain access to more light for our basement. So we started doing things like bi-level homes, split level. These would allow us to have our basements a little higher out of the ground and have more access to light. So again, that thinking is all part of providing better lighting, which we all want, more flexible space for the average person, the average family. And the market is really dictated by the builders. The builders will always tell you that they're building to market demand, but they come out of the gates first. They build, and they find out what the market actually wants. So if they're hearing that the basement is not is not as great a space as it could be, then they come up with innovative ways to make the basement a nicer space to be in. So the idea of bringing it further outside or up the ground level to have more lighting into the basement. Of course, that kind of happened in the 70s, 60s, 70s, this sort of split-level, bi-level house. And then land started to become expensive. And so now we get smaller lots, and then we have to get to mostly two-story homes. And because we have frost lines, we have water, and we build with wood, we want to keep our wood away from water. So generally, we're at least 2 feet above the ground, our main floor level, our entry level, to stay away from the water. So that kind of gives you a general sense of why we build the way we do.
Is it fair to say, too, that from the developer standpoint, their business has evolved as well, and the little builder is now joined with other little builders, and there are larger, bigger building firms, and it is to their benefit to have more cookie-cutter plans so that they can build faster without having to make changes to things too often? I don't mean to do them a disservice, because business is business, but I think that is a truth in today's market.
That's absolutely correct. Yeah, and it is a business. And frankly, when I was younger and first came out of architecture school, I laid a lot of blame on why we didn't have accessible housing on the builders, because I thought they made nothing but money and they were all rich and they have fancy cars and they have their own fancy houses. And obviously, in time, I've learned that that's just not true. And they're fighting.
Well, some of them do.
Yes, some of them do. That's true. It's same with architects. Some architects make a lot of money, and others just kind of eke out a living. But generally, I think it's safe to say that most builders are fighting to survive and keep their business running. So they're sort of risk adverse. They don't want to do too many different things that might, especially your speculative home builders, the ones that are building for who knows who's going to buy it. They want something that is fairly safe. So they try to find something that we call it cookie cutter. They would call it a sort of standard house. And with each of those standard home designs, you can alter it slightly. But safe to say, when you drive through a typical newer suburban neighborhood in Edmonton or Calgary here in Alberta, or I'm sure Toronto or Vancouver too, the houses tend to look the same, and the variation is not very much. And again, that has a lot to do with this idea that market value will stay high if everybody sort of behaves themselves. So we don't want too many risky homes out there that aesthetically look really odd compared to their neighbors. So we've kind of got to this point where we just don't want to do too much different. But we're in a time when there's just so many different people out there, and there's so many different needs, and nothing has brought that to a head more than our aging population, our boomer population, which is enormous. And we see it now in Canada and elsewhere in the world, where the dollar amount spent on healthcare for our seniors is astronomical. And we knew this was coming. It's not like we didn't know this was coming. So, I remember back in 1995, I'd only been an architect for a year, a registered architect for a year. I did a lunch talk for a CMHC, Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation luncheon, and my topic had to do with accessible housing. At the time, they called it flex housing, but it essentially was a kind of accessible housing. And they asked me, is this a trend or is it a niche market? In 1995, I said, this is a niche market. This is something that only a few people are doing, and they're probably not making a lot of money, but they're providing a great service for people that are outliers that can't fit in your typical home. But I said, at 1995, in the next 5 years, I can see this being a trend.
You wouldn't answer that way today, would you?
It's 2023, and and today I would say it's not 5 years away. It's probably further away. So it's been a real struggle to see where we're at right now. When in 1995 it seemed like there was some real momentum that was taking us to this next level of design that would accommodate so many different types of families and types of individuals. And the market also doesn't change much when the economy is strong. So, in the 90s, in the early 90s, the economy wasn't that strong, and then it started to get really good until about 2008. And so until then, you could build almost anything and make a fair bit of money. And then it got, the economy got weak again. And then, so we go in these cycles, and every time we get into a cycle of lower economy or tougher economy, that's when people start thinking about innovation and different ways of strategizing to design and build homes. And I kind of think that we're in that right now in 2023. We've just gone through a pandemic. The economy's getting back to a better place, but we're still struggling.
And you mentioned earlier about the different kinds of people that we are building for. And when you look around the world, I mean, certainly accessible housing tends to bring up images of people in wheelchairs and walkers, but I know you have children who are growing young families now. I do as well. I have a daughter with a 19-month-old, and she's expecting their next one, and so she's often managing strollers and bags of groceries. There are people who have temporary afflictions like a broken leg or sciatica. There are people with progressive diseases. There are people with diseases that are unseen. There are people who are just growing older, as you mentioned. So aren't we really building for everybody on a spectrum, but maybe we're misnaming it by calling it accessible housing. Maybe that just brings up the wrong image and we need to think of something else.
Yeah, so there's a couple of things that you mentioned that are really, really important. So one is that there still is this idea, let's call it a myth or an idea, that accessible design is designed for a specific population, a small population of people who use wheelchairs. So dispelling that myth is something that we've been doing for quite a long time now, trying to do anyway. And a good example of something out there that was once designed specifically for people who use wheelchairs that now people see the benefits for everyone is the curb ramp or curb cut. And those curb ramps or curb cuts you see in many downtowns and other parts of the community. They're at the corners of intersections, and they allow somebody in a wheelchair to get from the sidewalk level down to the street level and cross the street and then get back up to the sidewalk level on the other side. And we do see that those curb ramps benefit so many people, pushing, like you said, young families pushing strollers. And when I had children, I have three, my wife and I, we had like a tiny little stroller, like it barely fit our child. So now my kids have their own kids, and they come to my house with these like small vehicles that are their strollers, and they can have like rations for like if they get lost in the woods or something. I don't know, for a week, and my house happens to be one that has a level entry, so there's no steps. So certainly my kids and anybody else who enters my house has an easier way of getting in. So the curb cut has this enormous benefit. But I was around in Edmonton when there was no such thing as a curb cut. The curb cuts came to be in the 70s, and I was born in 64. So I remember my dad being a strong advocate for people with disabilities, as he was somebody who used a wheelchair. But he used a manual wheelchair, so he could not easily, but he could manage to get up either on his own and a usually a parking meter that would help him pull himself up the curb from the street level, or somebody behind him could help him push him up. So the curb ramp was not high on my dad's list of things to advocate for necessarily. But then we started to see more and more people use power wheelchairs, and of course they're quite heavy. And then all of a sudden, the need for this curb ramp became quite vital, actually. And so slowly you started to see it more and more. And then once it really caught on, and it was seemingly like overnight. All of a sudden, every city had curb cuts everywhere. And today, I think if you asked a young person working on the job site, pouring the concrete sidewalks and making these curb ramps, I'm sure they couldn't tell you why they're there. They just think, well, as long as people have been pouring sidewalks, they've probably been doing these curb ramps. And they certainly wouldn't know that the origins are because of people who use wheelchairs.
I want to refer to a podcast that you mentioned to me, and I went and listened to it. It was all about curb cuts. I'm going to list it in the show notes for this podcast because it was really, really interesting. But in that podcast, they talked about a group from Berkeley in the 60s. I mean, who doesn't know stories about California in the 60s? But they were called the Rolling Quads, and they would go out at night under cover of darkness and pour their own curb cuts because the city didn't do it for them, and they needed to be able to get around. People would just wake up the next morning, and there would be a curb ramp where there had not been one the day before. I thought that was hilarious.
Yeah. And it's funny because we didn't do quite that radical things. Well, maybe, but I was just a young guy. But I used to be around my dad and all his friends, and they did their own little stunts too to gain attention. Right? That in those days, that's what you had to do. You had to somehow find ways to get media attention. Or just you almost like do-it-yourselfer, right? But you were really going counter to often what the general public wanted. So that again, the general public is often slow to catch on to the benefits until they start seeing it for themselves. And my dad was a politician. He was a city councillor for 9 years here in Edmonton. He was a Liberal MLA in Alberta, and I remember. As a counselor, he was very, very popular, and but I do remember one time he managed to negotiate and get a series of curb ramps built for a young girl in a neighborhood that used her wheelchair to get to her junior high school. And my dad actually got a lot of phone calls and negative reactions from people in the community saying, "Why are you spending all this money just for one little girl?" Right? And today I would argue that that's one thing we wouldn't necessarily see as much anymore, right?
For sure.
So that that was in the late 80s, though, so not that long ago.
Right.
So there's still that attitudinal adjustment we continue to have to make, right? And that's definitely brings us back to the house and people's reaction to the house. So I do know today that you market your house as an accessible one, you're really limiting the number of people that even want to look at your house. And so in my mind, having an accessible house just means you should have more people wanting to look at it and purchase it because it has all these added benefits. But the attitude out there is that an accessible house is one that has been designed for somebody with a disability, and specifically somebody who uses a wheelchair. So somehow it's going to be not as effective for somebody who's, let's say, walking.
And yet it is effective to a greater degree for everyone. I've been in accessible houses. Of course, you have as well. You've built them. And you would not know. You wouldn't know unless you knew that there was anything different about it, which is a nice segue into your house because you have an accessible house. You've mentioned that it has a no-step entry. Tell us a little bit more about it. And then you have some stories about some other homes that you have dealt with in Medicine Hat and Calgary.
Yeah, so I'm actually going to go back even further than my own house and just go back to 1967 when my parents built their house. Again, a little bit historic, but brings us to our house. But my dad was able to gain access to a builder and find a lot and built built a new 1,100 square foot bungalow in the far south of Edmonton, as far the south you could get at the time. And the builder just took a stock plan, and really all they did was they made the hallways a little bit wider. But at the end of the day, when they finished the house, the doors were still 30 inches wide. My dad could just barely get through them. The bathroom was such that my dad would wheel in forwards. He could transfer into the bathtub or onto the toilet. He couldn't get underneath the sink. He would just, from the side, he would access the sink and the faucet. And then he would have to back out to get out of the bathroom. The kitchen really didn't offer much. It was just your standard kitchen. And even when they were building it, they built it more than 2 feet off the ground. And my dad said to the builder, "Well, how do I get in?" And so they just smushed a concrete ramp at about, I'm going to say it was about a 1 to 6 slope. So
wow.
Currently you would want to build at a 1 in 12, according to the Alberta Building Code. So twice as steep as what you would normally do today. And there was no landing at the top. So my dad basically used rails on the side of the ramp to pull himself up the ramp. He would lock his brakes in his wheelchair and then open the door, then unlock his brakes and get in. But again, he's on an incline as he's trying to get in the house. It's even worse trying to leave the house because he's on an incline trying to reach back and shut the door as his wheelchair wants to go down. And he used the rails to just sort of slow himself down as he got towards the detached garage. And that was considered accessible in 1967. I bought a house that isn't far away from my parents' house. So it was built in 1968, and it was a bungalow, much the same as what I grew up in, except there was no smushed up ramp. And we ended up adding a second story to the house, and then the unusual thing about our house in our neighborhood with back lanes, we had a front car garage. So this was a time when there were just a couple houses on our street that had front car garages, and they were just starting to think about this idea of the front car garage, which of course has had a huge impact on the way we design homes today in newer neighborhoods. So we were able to re-pour our driveway and sidewalk so that it just simply sloped to the front door of the house. And so my dad could now easily, before we did that, my dad would have these metal ramps that he kept in his van, and we'd prop them up on the stairs and push him up to get in the house and help him get down. With the new sidewalk, we were able to, or the new sidewalk to the door, he was able to just wheel right into the house. And we did plan to have, there's a space for an elevator, a future elevator in the house to get to the second floor. And there's a washroom on the ground level that would allow my dad or anybody else to use the bathroom. So this was this idea of what we call visitability, which means you design houses, and this should be the lowest way we build, the lowest common denominators. Every house should be built with this idea of visitability in mind. I can't see anybody benefiting from stairs.
Well, nobody does, except builders who get to build taller homes on smaller lots.
I guess, but they can even, they can build them a little bit lower. So this whole idea of stairs is like a whole nother topic, but I think it's still out there that people want, a few stairs because it just feels like a house. And I can take that idea of the stairs all the way back to Greek and Roman times when stairs were used to get onto a platform, and that's where the higher level people, the gods and goddesses, they were on that platform and they were higher than the people below. So, it kind of has that form of history to it. And somehow, even if you eliminate the stairs, just have a sloping sidewalk to the entrance that takes away from that idea, I guess. I don't know. It's sort of an odd thing that there's not enough people that have been fighting to make that change. And so you're starting to see that a little bit. And so my house is one that, we can pretty much grow in now. We can live in forever if we so choose. And technically, my wife and I are empty nesters.
Technically,
but but all three of our kids are within walking distance of our house. Well, one my son just moved a little further away, and I have three grandkids now and two on the way. So I'm actually on a 2-story, 3,000 square foot house. I'm actually working on a small renovation to the house to increase the size.
Oh no! Well,
because our house has become the gathering space. So it is this idea of the forever home. I think is kind of great, and our house is so accommodating because we have the no-step entrance, so everybody can get in and easily and bring the kids over, the grandkids and everything. We don't have to worry about steps and the kids falling down and all that kind of stuff.
And on the inside, you've made room for the potential for a future elevator. And that, it seems to me, would be so easy for builders to do because it's simply aligning closets on all the floors. That's the elevator shaft. And of course, we've got stair lifts and chair lifts and platform lifts and residential elevators. And sometimes a residential elevator can be more cost effective than a chairlift, depending on how many runs you have. So people should not think that because they've got a 2-story house, there's nothing to be done.
Yeah, that's absolutely correct. And I know we'll be in a future podcast, we'll be getting into the weeds more on this. But
right.
But yes, generally speaking, what I can say now is that the residential elevator is frankly quite economical in the global sense of a house build. So you can get a residential elevator for in and around $25,000. So
right.
For a $500,000, $800,000 build, depending on where you are in Canada, $25,000 is a small fraction of that. And you can, in a new house, you could build the elevator shaft and have everything ready to go for the elevator to be installed at a later date. Having said that, every one of my clients that had that idea initially to build the shaft and add the elevator later ended up adding the elevator during construction because they just saw the wisdom in that right away.
Yeah, it's a lot smarter.
And that does kind of lead to this discussion about clients that I've had that are looking for a house to renovate. Let's say they're in a rental situation, or the house that they live in just is too difficult to renovate, so they're looking for something to renovate. And first and foremost, I'll say that for anybody with a disability, especially somebody who uses a wheelchair, finding a house that lends itself to an easy renovation is extremely hard.
Right.
So we all have the same desire. There's neighborhoods we've targeted because of schools that our kids go to, maybe because of work, access to public transportation. We want the same freedom of choice as everybody else looking for a house. We have a certain bracket of dollars that we want to spend on the house. All of that kind of stuff factors into why we pick what we do. When you're somebody in a wheelchair looking for a house, all of a sudden your choices are extremely low.
And that's a really nice teaser for our next podcast, I think, because that's really the subject that we want to tackle in a bit more depth. But you've got stories about some houses in Medicine Hat and Alberta, and another 4-level split that you made accessible.
Yeah, so just, again, in a very general terms, because we will be kind of getting into the weeds a little bit more, but just going back to this idea of looking for houses is what people generally will do is they will, because of this elevator seems to have this kind of idea that this is the difficult piece of the puzzle. So they'll look for a home that looks like it would be an easy way to install an elevator into the house. So they often look for a footprint of a house, and a house that has a space that can get you from, let's say, the basement to the main floor, and if it's a 2-story house, up to the second floor as well. So that's what's guiding their decision making is the elevator, like how to easily install an elevator into the house. So there was one in Medicine Hat. I was just talking with some clients. They're finishing their 2-story house. They had a big lobby space, so the elevator and these sort of L-shaped stairs. So there was a nice spot for an elevator to easily fit into this big foyer space. And in Calgary, I'm just working on a house right now that's a really nice footprint. It's only 14 inches off the ground. It's bungalow, and we can easily modify everything, add the elevator, and so it'll in terms of ease of doing this renovation, it's one of the best that I've seen. But again, it just goes back to this idea of like, where do we find these houses that sort of fit our income bracket and all that kind of stuff. And one caveat I should say that is my experience, but for other people they don't have that same experience. Most of my involvement as an architect on projects is through the work I do with Workers' Compensation Board. So the Workers' Compensation Board will pay for the renovation to the house. So all of a sudden, that big piece that influences what we buy is not as important. It's you're being held by WCB, or if there is money involved already, like a lawsuit or something like that. So generally, I'm working with clients who are at a slightly higher income level that have more choice because they have more money. And so often I don't get involved in projects where it has to be like super, super affordable. So that's the majority of people, and that's the struggle that many of those people have trying to find a house. And just because we won't be able to talk about it in future podcasts too, but a house that I did, which was a 4-level split, I'm quite proud of it, and I it's real outside of the box thinking, which takes us back to our general conversation about getting designers and builders to build in more innovative ways. I did a house for a family where the son uses a wheelchair, and we designed a new 4-level split house with ramps inside instead of stairs. So as far as I know, it's the only house in Edmonton that has sets of ramps instead of 3 sets of ramps instead of stairs to gain access to these various levels. And Daniel was only 6 when he lost all 4 limbs to meningitis, and he's 32 now, I think it is. And so he was able to grow up in a house where he could get around. He can operate a joystick with the little bit of arm that he has. And he can just cruise around the whole house. So his mom and him have been able to grow in that house in a very flexible, very independent kind of way, and it relieves mom of so much pressure to take care of her son and gives her son independence. And a big thing to mention too is the fact that Daniel uses a power wheelchair. So all of his friends came to his house instead of him going everywhere else, because you can't go to other people's homes to visit them even, because how are they going to get your wheelchair up to the main floor level? So not only does Daniel have a really great perspective on accessible housing, but so do all of his friends, which I think is really fascinating.
Right. So the perspective piece leads us into how we approach the issue today to make some changes. I mean, his friends have had the blessing of their friendship with Daniel to educate them and to change their minds when perhaps before that they wouldn't have even thought about it. So new houses are being built all the time. But at the same time, we have this huge stock of existing homes that people don't want to leave, may not be able to afford to leave. There are a number of reasons why we need to have approaches that are different for both. But so from a very high level, how do you think we should approach the issue of changing minds today?
Well, the key word would be education. So we just need people to understand what all the issues are, and more so how to solve the problems that do exist. The biggest problem is that people don't generally understand the issues until it actually happens to them. So I grew up with a dad in a wheelchair, so I've been exposed to this my whole life. Daniel, as you mentioned, Daniel and his friends got to understand and appreciate accessible housing through their experience being friends with Daniel. And so we tend to learn through experience, and that just all takes time. So the struggle that I've always had for throughout my career has been how to fast track that. So how to get people interested and stimulated to think about this more and want to do something about it. That's the general public, educating the general public, educating our builders and developers and our designers, and also educating our politicians and our key decision makers. How important this issue is. So really comes down to that education, and with our ability to access information now in the computer, I think we need to rely on people doing their own research as well. So it's hard and takes time, but if you're a homeowner looking for a house that is accessible, or you want to build a new house that's accessible, it's in your best interest to learn as much as you can about the building industry, to know how to approach a builder and say, these are the things I need. Like, I need a no-step entrance, or I need a residential elevator. And unfortunately, a lot of builders will say, oh, well, a residential elevator is $150,000. And if you don't know, you go, wow, I can't afford that, right?
Right.
Or the no-step entrance, it can't be done because we have to build, off the ground to keep our wood our wood floors away from the water. There's ways around that to protect the wood and do the no-step entrance. It's easy to do. But if you don't know that it can be done, then it's really hard to challenge the designer or builder if they're telling you that it can't be done. So it's upon us to also educate ourselves and try to learn as much as we can. And that's a difficult thing to do in this day and age when there's just so much other information that we can access. Some of it's just, for fun, right?
Right.
So I can learn about how to build a no-step entrance, or I could, watch a movie on my phone, and most people would probably go to the movie. So it is tough, and then all of a sudden, you have a family member that's in a car accident, or you're a young couple and you have a child with severe disabilities, and your world is rocked, and you don't know where to go, you don't know where to start. And here in Alberta, I've managed to gain a bit of a reputation and name for myself. So a lot of times people come to me and they just don't know where to start. So I try to help them get started the best I can. But one thing that's telling of the times is the sheer volume now of people contacting me is so high that for the first time in my career, I've had to turn people away and just tell them, I'm sorry, I just don't have time to help you right now. Try to find some information. That's why I have a website that has the podcast we've done in the past on my website, so people can at least get started and start learning something, and hopefully they have the discipline and desire to learn more for themselves, and then maybe come back to me at a time when, or hopefully more people that do what I do that can help them, right? So we need more builders that are actually building these things. We need more architects and designers that really understand the issues and can really help people. Don't just rely on books and standards.
I find myself talking to people a lot about advocating for their future selves. So when you're, 40 years old or 50 years old and you're renovating that kitchen that you're tired of, if you plan to stay in that house, why not renovate it for what you're going to need 20 years down the road and do some serious thinking about that? Maybe there are people in your life that have arthritis. Maybe you yourself have a progressive disease. Maybe you recognize that range of motion will be an issue. I mean, it doesn't have to be something horrible, but if people would think about this down the road, case in point, I just recently bought a new place. It won't be ready for a while yet, but as I was looking at the development, I said to the sales consultants, I gave them my business card and said, you should hire me to give a seminar to the people who buy your homes so that I can tell them the sorts of upgrades they would need to live in these homes forever. And she said, yes, she would talk about that with her superiors, but she said, we have this whole accessibility team. So if somebody comes to us and has a disability and needs accessibility features, we can accommodate that. And I said, that's lovely, but what I'm talking about are things that will allow people to have homes that function better for them, not only now, but in the future, when they don't even think about the ways that they will need to use that home 20 years down the road. So people advocating for their future selves would be an idea too.
Absolutely. And that, that's a great point. And I think it has to do with the way we market that concept. So if you, and I've been around this for a long time, so I can say this with some authority, if you try to market it like, one day you're going to be in a wheelchair, or one day you're going to have arthritis, and people just don't want to hear that,
no.
Right? So they're like, oh, okay, well, I guess I'll deal with that when the time comes. So you're not making it very sexy, I guess you could say, right? Like you're not attracting people to the idea as much. And so I know in the design world, and you see it already, especially in places like the United States, where there's just a huge market of people who are older. You see this idea of making, especially kitchens, making it easier for people to use who might have arthritis, who might have trouble reaching up or reaching down, might be in a wheelchair. But they don't really talk about it like that. They talk about it as, this idea, like back to the curb cut, this idea that, what we're doing is designing something that just benefits everybody. And it benefits you now, it benefits your children when they're just little, it benefits you when you're older. But right now, it's just a really good kitchen, right? Like you just really get all these benefits. And if you ever want to sell it, sell your house, this kitchen's going to make the value of your house even more. Right? Because it's just it offers so much to your buying public. That idea, that cultural shift in the market, I think, is what needs to be done and what needs to happen.
Semantics.
It is in a way, right? Even in my world, the design world, when you go to a school of architecture, and I went through this myself. I went into architecture school with the idea that I would leave with the skill set to be an architect who would specialize in barrier-free design. So throughout my schooling, I just kept pushing that agenda. And I didn't really realize it at the time, but my professors didn't know enough to really comment on it, right? So they just said, well, that's what the code is for. You'll learn all that stuff when you get out into the real world. Like right now, just dream, And I'm like, I am dreaming. I'm dreaming of a time when houses are built for everybody.
Well, you mentioned...
What better dream is there than that?
You mentioned code, and you and I were both in attendance at the Rick Hansen Foundation conference a short while ago, and one phrase that stuck with me was one of the presenters said, code is the bare minimum that anyone needs to do in order to avoid being sued.
That's it, exactly.
That really stuck with me. So we need people to advocate for themselves and for their loved ones who perhaps have disabilities. So the self-advocacy piece is important too. We need more champions in the building industry, people to turn their minds to the type of work that you have built your career on. And, I have a note here. It's worth noting that designing for accessibility, adaptability, and flexibility is the true form of sustainable design. And that's a quote from you. Because it satisfies the long-term living requirements for the largest number of people of all ages and abilities. So when we look at new builds and renovations, in a lot of ways, those are two separate discussions. So let's look at a new building environment to start out with. What do we specifically need there in our champions?
First of all, I'll say that sustainability and accessibility are kind of more alike than they are separate issues. And what I find really curious is that most people who are in my camp, the accessibility camp, completely understand that sustainability is part of accessibility and accessibility is part of sustainability. But I would argue that most of your designers and builders focused on sustainable issues and sustainable design still see accessibility as something that's like an oddity or sort of distant from this. So that's again, that's tying those two together. I think is really really important to get everybody thinking about, right?
Right.
So
I agree.
This idea that designing for flexibility is important. It truly is a sustainable issue. So again, we've talked about making a house so that there's no steps at the main entrance. The idea of the elevator shaft, having that flexibility in mind. We talked about the kitchen. So you really just design a kitchen so that it can be designed so that it's easy to adapt in the future. More open space is typically a little easier, less walls to move, less structural issues in the future. And what's really fascinating, I think, is that this does, I know a little off topic, but this does translate into bigger buildings as well. So if we started designing our really big buildings with this idea of flexibility in mind, that would go a long ways to satisfying both the accessibility and sustainability agendas. So single family houses are one thing, multifamily, all of this, if we design with these ideas in mind, I think it's really going to help for future generations. And for me, always, whether it's a residential building or a public building, the key always revolves around the bathroom. So
right.
Making the bathroom so that it's big enough for somebody, let's say in a wheelchair, to use, will forever be able to accommodate anybody. And I know we'll be talking about this in more detail in a future podcast. But
yeah, we've got a whole podcast coming up on bathrooms.
Yeah. So this idea of the bathroom really getting some real attention is something we need to do. And some of the more simple things, you see this. Some of these things are happening naturally. The doors being wider, that wasn't an accessibility agenda. That was just something that came because people are buying bigger pieces of furniture and TVs and all that, so they just need wider doors to get through. And it just reminds me of something that I talked about years ago that I thought was really fascinating. Was one of the greatest inventions that has come about in my time. And for young people, they won't get it really, but luggage bags with wheels.
Yes,
I'm old enough to have been traveling without luggage bags with wheels. Right? You just carried them everywhere, and now you got a dad in a wheelchair, so you got to carry his bag too.
Right.
Or like put all your bags on his lap as he wheels around. But then wheeling around the airport to get to multi-levels of the airport and all of that is finding the elevator, all that kind of stuff. But wheels on luggage all of a sudden meant nobody wants to go downstairs with a big bag, a big heavy bag on wheels. So all of a sudden now our airports are designed with ramps everywhere, not stairs as much, right? And none of that has to do with making it more accommodating for somebody in a wheelchair. It all had to do with making it better for everybody. So again, it's another great example of the ramp being of benefit for everybody, not just for a small population of people. That kind of thing, and again, the no-step entrance just seems like a natural to me. That should just be commonplace.
Right.
And it would be unusual. It would be unusual to ask for stairs at the front door. That's what I'd like to see.
That would be amazing. So from your lips to God's ear, when we're looking at dealing with accessibility issues, there are some experts that we can bring in who aren't typically thought of in terms of the building environment. I'm thinking of occupational therapists, for instance. Can you talk a little bit about the kind of contribution that these professionals can make to the housing industry?
I actually work quite a bit with occupational therapists in working for specific clients. So most of my houses are very tailor-made and designed for an individual with a very specific disability. So What's kind of transpired in that is occupational therapists are a valuable part of that process. And so what we need to see in our schools of occupational therapy and architecture is a more cross education. So letting occupational therapists know more about the design world and letting the design world know more about occupational therapists would be extremely helpful. But definitely an occupational therapist looks at the person with the disability, or anybody really, and how they engage with the environment. So I've often been told a physiotherapist kind of deals with your injury, your condition, and how to, let's say something's not working right with your arms or your arm, they'll work with you to make your arm function better. An occupational therapist is trained to think more globally, if I can say that. So they look at how you as an individual function within the environment that you live in. So this is really how I approach things as an architect as well, is how do people engage the space? And again, I don't design for what I would consider the average person. I design for my world, and my world includes people who are blind, people who are deaf, people who are in wheelchairs. So I can't design without thinking about all these issues all at the same time.
The subtrades. There is such a large push toward college these days for trades because we can't get enough of them. Electricians and plumbers and carpenters. And I know I was looking at some data just locally about our local school board, and the bulk of graduates are going to college, not to university anymore. It was 61%, I want to say, with a much smaller number going on to university, and then something like 8% going right into the workforce. And the subtrades play such an important role in how buildings come together, but they don't learn this stuff in school. How do we get the curriculums changed?
Well, yeah, that's a tough one. Like trade schools, and I think there should be more emphasis put on that in the earlier years, junior high school, for example, high school. There can be more emphasis on understanding kind of practical things, I think, like building a house. And I remember taking a drafting class in high school, but that was kind of my exposure to the world. But, I would have loved to have been part of a class, let's say that part of the class was to go to a Habitat for Humanity job site and actually work on site. And I would say that every school of architecture should force students to do that kind of thing, right? Be on a construction site and actually, obviously when it's safe to be on the site, but just to understand and appreciate what trades do. They are very important to our built environment, and sometimes they don't get enough credit for the skilled work that they do. And I find today there really is a lack of training. So often a young person will be hired by a construction company and not necessarily given enough training. So they're sort of forced to learn on their own. And, I hate the idea of like, okay, frame this wall and look it up on YouTube and it'll tell you how to frame a wall.
That's frightening.
But, that's how a lot of people are kind of learning, right? And so you need skilled people on the site to mentor and train younger people and teach them the crafts and how to make it work. And this is where I find a real disconnect is this whole communication of, myself as the designer trying to communicate to a general contractor, this is what I need to happen to make this work for this person who, let's say, uses a wheelchair. That contractor then takes my information and sends it to the subtrade. And that subtrade, that person that the contractor talks to may not be the person that actually executes the work. Right. An example would be an electrician. I say on my drawings, I say I want my light switches to be at 41 inches or 42 inches off the floor. The contractor tells the electrician, I want the light switches to be 42 inches off the floor. Normally they're about 48 or 50 inches off the floor. But then the electrician sends one of their younger junior people go and install some light switches. So that junior person, all they know is that light switches are normally at 50 inches or 48 inches.
So that's what they
just
do.
Do it.
Yeah.
And so the communication kind of gets lost, right? So it's really a lot harder than it should be, and everybody just has to start getting used to it, I guess, used to doing these things. But it's getting there more quickly again. That is the tough thing. So it'll happen in time. We'll start seeing a lot of these things coming to be, accessibility features coming to be. But it seems like a shame when I drive around suburban Edmonton or suburban Calgary, and we're fighting to talk about renovations and building new houses that are more accessible, and yet houses are going up faster than we can talk about, and none of them are being made accessible. So we're sort of really fighting an uphill battle.
We talked earlier about the cookie cutter plans, or the stock plans, as you called them, and you have mentioned that life would be so much easier if there were these plans, stock plans available that had the accessibility features built in. There's a business for somebody.
There is, right? And I think in the building world, you need some of the key builders to do it and make it work, and make a legitimate business case for it, and demonstrate that yes, this is good stuff and we can make money doing it. And then the others will kind of follow, right? So we, when you go down a typical show home street, you might have 6 or 7 different builders building a house on the show home street. Generally speaking, the houses more or less are the same. They have slightly different looks, but you're gonna see more or less the same floor plan and same features being promoted. There was a time that there was a room on the main floor of a 2-story house called the Flex Room. This room that could be almost anything. And then somebody figured out a way to build over an attached garage. They called that the bonus room. And so you see these little trends, right? That somebody tries it works, and then everybody does it, and then you move on to the next kind of trend. And accessibility has never really been that true trend, right?
Right.
You do see some of these show home streets with their elevators in them, but they're few and far between.
Right. And one of the things we touched on earlier also was the political will that is needed to make this happen. I find that too often when I go to council meetings at pick a city, it doesn't really matter where it is. It really seems to be the developers that are driving the planning for a given area instead of the local politicians who are supposed to know their own market better, being able to say, well, we want a percentage to be visitable or accessible. And they don't say that because they're afraid that the developer will go on down the road to the next city where they won't encounter a roadblock like this or somebody with a new idea. So getting the municipal staff who make the recommendations often to councils, and then getting council members on board and get them to start thinking about questions to ask around visitability and accessibility, that would be wonderful. That's a constant conversation, I find.
You're absolutely right. And generally speaking, across Canada, North America, really, government tries to stay out of the business of residential design and construction for the most part. As you were talking about how government could be more forceful, it is true. I think builders hate that. They don't want the government telling them what to do. But we do see that, and most recently we've seen that in a new energy code in Canada. So across Canada, builders have to meet certain energy codes, which means more insulation. Generally, a little added cost to the home build, which adds the cost to the market. But the government has seen the wisdom in collectively building housing stock that is more energy efficient. And why government hasn't been able to collectively think that way about accessibility, or hasn't had the nerve to kind of force the issue, is the complex question, I guess,
right,
in all of this, right? So I do know that when it comes to accessibility, the city of Edmonton, the city of Calgary are two cities I know better than the rest of Canada. But anything that the cities are responsible for, like libraries, recreation centers, they're designed and built to a very high level of accessibility. Rec centers in Alberta are generally really, really good when it comes to being inclusive and being accessible for as many people as possible. And they control it. They make sure it happens. And staff that work with the architects and builders, they really force the issue, and they have the ability and the power to make it happen. But the housing industry is just kind of left alone, right? And we're always told, well, we'll do it. Don't make us do it. We'll do it when the market demands it. But the market doesn't know what to demand if they don't know what exists or what are the possibilities, right?
There you go.
So.
Yeah, and so that would lead us into just a bit of a discussion on renovations, because we've talked about new builds, and renovations are somewhat different in that we've got homeowners who have lived in homes for 20, 30, 40 years or more. They tell us that over 90% of them have no desire to do anything other than stay in their own homes and their own communities. Home care is not where we need it to be. Families are stretched. They're geographically distant, and staying in homes in familiar communities is, in fact, what is best for people for a variety of reasons, including social engagement and mental health and so forth. But they don't know what to ask for. And when they're talking to contractors who don't know what to offer, it becomes the perfect situation to do what we've always done because we've always done it this way.
Yeah, that's exactly it. And the pandemic has done nothing but escalate all of that, everything that you just said, right? So even more so now, people want to stay in their own homes.
Right.
They don't want to end up in a larger long-term healthcare facility that a pandemic can just a virus can just literally suck the life out of the building, right? And so it touches on all those things, right? Like you need people to know more about what they want and what they need. You need the builders to be able to offer better solutions, better suggestions. So it's a matter of both parties being more educated, right? And typically my own experience has been that until the market, the buying public and the builders, until they get to a certain level of understanding, it's up to our decision makers and our governments to kind of force the issue. And sometimes that's actual codes and standards. Sometimes it's financial incentives. So why couldn't there be something where if you're renovating your house and you're renovating it to age in place and be more friendly for people with disabilities, why wouldn't there be some kind of government incentive that would allow you to pay a good chunk of that for you? So it's not on you to spend all that money, right? And the government should understand that that's a good idea, because then that person doesn't necessarily end up in a hospital setting where the cost of healthcare just keeps escalating, right? Keeps rising.
I would argue that by doing that, it would actually positively impact the healthcare budgets.
It would.
Yep.
It would definitely do that, right? And it's just, unfortunately, in the political world, most of your politicians, they'll hate me for saying this, but they don't think much further ahead than the next election, right? So they're not thinking 20, 30 years down the road. I think they're all going to say they do, but they're really looking at how they can get elected in the next election. And it's the nature of the beast. But sometimes you have to make some tough decisions now to help future generations, right? And I understand it's a really tough thing. I grew up around a politician who was in that decision-making role, and he had to make some tough decisions, right? And what I found is my father did often think about issues like, I'm going to reference our light rail transit, our public transportation system. In the early days in our downtowns, he and others advocated for elevators to be installed. And there was a huge fight on that. Why are we going to spend all this money on elevators when it's only going to benefit a few people? And he won. He was successful in getting elevators installed at that time. Today, it just gets done. But imagine the amount of money that he saved the city in the long run because they did it way back then instead of having to do it later on. And he also fought for LRT earlier on, 30 years ago. And a lot of communities just didn't want the LRT running through their neighborhoods, right? So we're doing it today. We're doing a lot of LRT now in Edmonton when it's just that much more expensive. And so that's an LRT example or a public transportation example, but I would argue the same can be said about our healthcare and how we house ourselves. And I think government can step in some way and force the issue more. There is one example that I can give you in Winnipeg. It was done through the Manitoba government. It's called Bridgewater in Winnipeg, and it's a subdivision for about 30,000 people, as I understand it. And lots were actually building lots for single-family homes were designed to easily accommodate houses that could be visitable. So this idea of having a no-step entrance. So once the builders purchased the lot and built, it was easy to do without having to have steps at the front door. And from what I understand too, I don't know this for sure, but it's one of the fastest selling communities in all of Winnipeg. So sales are high; they're doing well, but it hasn't been replicated yet anywhere else in Canada.
Right.
And here in Edmonton, we have a site, our old downtown airport, Blatchford, which can accommodate about 30,000 people. So myself and others went before council maybe 9 years ago, and made that same plea. Right? We said they did it in Bridgewater, like you can do it here at Blatchford. And council at the time just said, we'll let the market decide. So it just goes back to that original question you asked me is like how do we move the needle forward?
Right.
And I don't think we can. I don't think we can do it really well without government involvement. It's
right.
just the reality.
And homeowners advocating for themselves too, as has been mentioned. Right.
That's true. And people with disabilities themselves can be really great advocates. And again, I grew up in a different time, but there was nothing, right? When I was growing up, there were no curb cuts. There was just nothing. So people with disabilities were really forced into a corner, and they had to fight their way out of it. Today, people with disabilities have struggles, but the struggles are not the same as what they were in the 60s. And so a lot of times people just get on with their lives, right? And they tend not to be as strongly motivated to advocate or be an activist. So I really applaud those that do. And we do have a pretty good culture here in Edmonton of people with disabilities that are really fighting hard, right? And right. I'm going to argue that has a lot to do with my father and others that started that in the 60s, right? And went on to become decision makers themselves. So I personally know some extremely smart, clever people who use wheelchairs that I would encourage to run for city council or a provincial government. But I'm not sure anybody is seeing the wisdom in that these days.
Right.
It's a tough job to begin with. It seems harder these days.
Right. We should mention that there are lots of OTs that do home environment assessments for people who are looking to maybe renovate their homes. They're at the early stages of thinking about it, and the OTs can look at it in terms of what their personal needs are. There are also professionals such as myself who specialize in aging in place strategies and can help with new builds and renovations, and there aren't very many of us, but we're out there. So, there is more and more help for people who really don't know where to start. But anyway, let's stop here and let people know that our next podcast in this series will look at the 3 areas of a home that Ron looks at to assess whether or not and how an existing home might be renovated. I can't wait for that one because I think that's the one that a lot of people are going to be wanting to hear.
Yeah, and I'm anxious to talk about it too. I just want to go back. The one thing that you just mentioned about some of the experts that are out there, just one thing to add to that too, because I think it's really important, is I think there also is a bit of a cultural issue that a lot of this stuff costs money right? So to hire you or me as experts to come and assess your house is just money that, I don't know, people don't seem to want to spend. Like they've just sort of been culturally raised to think that that's stuff that people should, neighbors or friends should just be able to help you with. So there's also got to be a little bit of a shift in appreciation and understanding that some of us have spent a long time getting pretty good at this, and that it's hard for us to do everything for free. And, it's one thing to have a quick conversation with somebody on the phone, but it's another thing to come to your house and assess it and all that kind of stuff. And people have to see the value in that. Like, yeah, sure, I might spend a few $100s on this expert, but look at all the money that person's going to save me with this quick conversation, or this few hours that I spend with that person.
And I get to stay in my own home, in my own community.
Yeah, and the other, and sorry, I'm prolonging this, but
that's okay.
The other thing that we just can't put value, like an actual dollar figure on, is that emotional reward, like of being able to stay in your home. Like, again, in my world, architects are celebrated for their sculptural designs, for these buildings that look outrageous and pleasing to the eye. But the biggest compliment I consistently get from my clients are, you've turned my 3-hour, 4-hour bathroom routine in the morning to a half an hour. So that gives me 3 extra hours every single day to do other stuff that's way more fun than getting ready for the day, spending that time fighting in the bathroom. So how do you put value on that? Like that, it's enormous, right? So people have to somehow learn to appreciate that that's what we can do as experts, is we can bring that value to the conversation.
Perfect. Well, let's end it there, and I will look forward to our next podcast. And to our listeners, thank you for joining us, and please stay tuned for the next in this series in Real Life Renos, the podcast. Real Life Renos, the podcast is a production of Reno Studios, executive produced by Karen Brown. This is Real Life theme, music, and lyrics by Jane Carmichael, recorded at Swamp Songs Recording Studio in Lucan, Ontario, engineered by Matt Weston. Thank you for tuning in.